The uprising began at dawn. Yuna had chosen the timing deliberately, scheduling the assault to coincide with another public sentencing in the central square. Maximum witnesses meant maximum impact. The first sign that something was wrong came when the colony's main power grid flickered and died, plunging the watchtowers into temporary blindness. In that moment of confusion, the Forsaken struck from 3 directions at once. Mach led the primary assault team through the eastern gate, which had been left mysteriously unlocked by sympathetic workers on the inside. Tova's scouts created diversions throughout the colony, setting fires and triggering alarms in patterns designed to scatter the god response. And Savin, the old Govashi, who had spent 15 years teaching his people to survive through caution, marched at the head of a column of armed Forsaken who had finally decided that survival without freedom was no longer enough. The guards fought back with professional discipline, but they were overwhelmed by something they had never expected. The workers were rising. Years of accumulated resentment exploded into open rebellion as laborers and servants turned on their overseers mining. Equipment became weapons. Chemical supplies became improvised explosives. And the strict hierarchy that had maintained order for decades collapsed in a matter of hours. Commander Dreth rallied his remaining forces in the administrative sector and managed to establish a defensive perimeter around Varth's personal compound. Hold position, he ordered through his communicator. Reinforcements are coming. The orbital station has been contacted. But the orbital station was not responding. Yuna had spent the previous week working with the Forsaken's few technicians to assemble a jamming device from salvaged components. It would not last forever, but it would last long enough. She made her way through the chaos of the fighting, with Dren at her side, despite her protests that the child should stay somewhere safe. I earned my place here, Dren had insisted, and Yuna had run out of arguments to counter a truth so obvious. They found the entrance to Varth's compound guarded by a dozen of Dreth's most loyal soldiers. Mach appeared beside them with his rifle raised and a predatory gleam in his eyes. I can draw their fire, he offered. Give you a chance to get through. No, Yuna shook her head. No more sacrifices. We do this smart. She pulled out a small communications device and spoke into it. Tova. Now. A moment later, an explosion rocked the far side of the compound, drawing the attention of the guards for just long enough. Yuna and her team moved through the gap like water through a crack. Inside the compound, the resistance was fierce, but disorganized. Guards ran through the corridors with no clear orders, their chain of command shattered by the speed and ferocity of the assault. Yuna navigated by memory, following the mental map she had assembled from weeks of intelligence gathering. The chief magistrate's personal chambers were on the top floor, accessible by a single stairway that was supposed to be impregnable. They found Dreth at the base of those stairs, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, but still standing with a weapon in each hand. Human, he growled when he saw Yuna. Varth was right to fear you. Step aside, Yuna replied calmly. This does not have to end with more death. Dreth's answer was a burst of gunfire that sent them scrambling for cover. The firefight lasted less than a minute. Mach's superior position and marksmanship ended it with a single well-placed shot that took Dreth through the leg and dropped him to the ground. They left him there, disarmed and immobilized, for others to deal with. The stairs led up to a hallway lined with expensive artwork and luxurious furnishings, the accumulated wealth of years of exploitation. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. Yuna pushed it open and found Varth standing beside a window, staring out at the chaos consuming his colony. He turned when she entered, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The chief magistrate who had sentenced her to die, and The human who had refused to accept that sentence. You should have stayed in the desert, Varus said quietly, his voice stripped of its theatrical cruelty, leaving only exhaustion and something that might have been resignation. You should have let me go free. Una replied. Varus let out a bitter laugh. Perhaps, he admitted. I underestimated your kind. That much is obvious. But it will not matter in the end. He gestured toward the sky beyond the window. The fleet will come, he continued. When my superiors learn what has happened here, they will send ships and soldiers, and they will burn this entire planet to glass rather than let a rebellion spread. Una shook her head slowly. Before your communications went down, I sent a transmission, she said, to 3 different news networks across the sector. Live footage of everything that has happened here. Documented evidence of illegal slave labor, wrongful convictions, mass executions disguised as justice. Voreth's scales went pale. The Dominion can spin many things, Una continued, but they cannot spin this. Not when the evidence is already in the hands of journalists and activists and political opponents who have been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. You are bluffing. I am a freighter pilot who was wrongly convicted of smuggling weapons, Una said with a thin smile. I have spent my entire career learning how to move information through channels that authorities cannot easily control. This was never just about taking your colony, Vareth. This was about making sure the galaxy sees what you have done. The chief magistrate stood frozen as the implications of her words sank, and his political career was over. His reputation was destroyed. And if the evidence she had sent was as damning as she claimed, he might face prosecution from his own government simply to satisfy the public outcry. His hand moved toward a weapon concealed beneath his robes. I would not do that, a voice said from behind him. Varus spun too. Find Dren standing in a side doorway he had not noticed. A guard's rifle held steady in her small hands. Her compound eyes reflected no fear, only a cold determination that seemed impossible in someone so young. You, Vareth breathed. Recognition dawning. The child, the thief, the one you sentenced to die for stealing bread, Dren confirmed. I remember what you said when they dragged me away. You said I was garbage that the desert would dispose of. Dren, Una said softly. The young Talari did not lower her weapon. I could kill you right now, she said to Vareth, her voice steady, and no one would blame me. No one would even question it. Then do it, Vareth snarled, some of his old arrogance returning. Prove that you are no better than the monster you claim I am. Dren held his gaze for a long moment. Then she lowered the rifle. You are not worth becoming a killer over, she said simply. And I want you to live. I want you to face trial. I want you to see the faces of everyone you have hurt when they tell their stories and the galaxy listens. Vareth's composure finally shattered. His shoulders slumped and his proud bearing crumbled, and he suddenly looked like what he truly was. A small, cruel man whose power had been built on the suffering of others. Mock stepped forward and secured the former chief magistrate with restraints salvaged from his own guards. Take him to the square, Una ordered, the same one where he sentenced all those people to die. The fighting outside had mostly ended by the time they emerged from the compound. Pockets of resistance remained, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Forsaken had won in the central square, where Vareth had stood so many times delivering death sentence with theatrical pleasure. The survivors gathered. Workers and Forsaken and newly freed prisoners stood together, species that had been taught to distrust each other, finding common ground in their shared liberation. Vareth was brought before them in chains, and for the first time in his life he experienced what it felt like to be judged by those he had considered beneath him. He deserves death, someone shouted from the crowd. He deserves worse than death. Another voice agreed. Una raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent. He will face trial, she announced. A fair one. with evidence and witnesses and the opportunity to defend himself. Everything he denied to his victims, because that is how we prove we are better than what he made us. Some faces in the crowd showed disappointment, but most showed understanding justice was not the same as vengeance, and they had seen enough death to know the difference. As the crowd began to disperse, Mach approached Yuna with a question. In his eyes, what happens now? He asked. Yuna looked up at the sky where the first ships were appearing on the Vultures horizon, not warships but civilian vessels. Relief transports and news crews and investigators responding to the evidence she had spread across the sector. Now we make sure this never happens again, she said. Here or anywhere else? Dren appeared beside her, the rifle finally set aside. Just a child again, instead of a soldier. But there was something different in her eyes now. A strength that had not been there before. Thank you, the young Talari said quietly. For what? For teaching me that surviving is not enough. Dren replied, that we have to fight for something more. Yuna put her hand on the child's shoulder, and together they watched the ships descend above them. The twin suns of Kethrin Ivy blazed down on a world that had been designed as a grave, but graves could become gardens if you were stubborn enough to keep planting seeds in humans. Yuna reflected. Had always been stubborn. It was what they did best. The rescue went exactly as Yuna had planned. 12 new prisoners stumbled through the colony gates into the burning wasteland. Their faces twisted with the same terror and despair that Yuna remembered from her own sentencing 3 weeks before. 2 guards followed them at a lazy distance, weapons holstered, clearly unconcerned about any threat from a group of condemned criminals walking to their deaths. They never saw the forsaken coming. Mach led the strike. Team of 8 volunteers who rose from the sand like vengeful spirits, their bodies covered in dust the same color as the desert floor. Their movements silent and coordinated from days of practice. The guards were unconscious before they could reach their weapons. The prisoners were so shocked they could barely move, until Tova appeared among them, speaking quickly and calmly. Follow us if you want to live, she said. Ask questions later. By the time the colony's watchtowers spotted the commotion on the distant sand, there was nothing left to see but empty desert and 2 guards lying in the dirt with splitting headaches and careers that were effectively over. Chief Magistrate Varath's rage could be heard throughout the colony. Find them, he screamed at Commander Dreth. His scales flushed dark with fury. I want patrols doubled. I want sensors deployed. I want every rock within 50 kilometers searched until those prisoners are found. Dreth, a heavy-set Gavashi with the cold eyes of a professional killer, simply nodded and began issuing orders. But even as his guards spread out across the wasteland, Yuna was already underground, watching the chaos she had created through scouts positioned at hidden vantage points. That went well, Mach observed with something that might have been a smile on his scarred face. That was the easy part, Yuna replied. Now comes the hard part. Over the following week, she put the second phase of her plan into motion. Tova had identified several workers in the colony who could be trusted. People who had been quietly resisting, in small ways for years, and waiting for a chance to do something more. Through a complicated series of dead drops and coded messages, Yuna began feeding information into the colony's labor force. The walk is not a death sentence. Survivors exist in the desert. Resistance is possible. The whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Workers who had kept their heads down for years began to look up and meet each other's eyes with something they had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Vara sensed the change in atmosphere, even if he could not identify its source. The workers are getting restless, Dreth reported during one of their daily briefings. Productivity is down, and there have been 3 incidents of guards being disrespected in the past 2 days alone. Then make examples. Vorath hissed. Remind them what happens to those who forget their place. But making examples only made things worse. Every public punishment now carried an undercurrent of defiance. Faces in the crowd that did not look away. Whispers that continued even after the guards had finished their brutal work, and then Yuna made her next move. A message appeared scratched into the wall of the workers' barracks overnight, visible to hundreds before the guards could scrub it away. The Easter marker, it read, "Midnight. Freedom awaits." Dreth brought the news to Vorath personally. It is obviously a trap, the chief magistrate declared, his confidence returning. They want us to send forces to the Easter marker while they strike somewhere else. Or they are trying to recruit from the worker population, Dreth suggested. The message was placed where only workers would see it. Then we give them what they expect, Vorath said with a cruel smile. Send 50 guards to the Easter marker, hidden among the rocks. And when these so-called survivors come to collect their new recruits, we will crush them once and for all. Dreth nodded and turned to carry out the orders. He did not see Vorath's smile falter slightly as he wondered, for just a moment, why a human freighter pilot was proving so much harder to kill than he had expected. At midnight, 50 of the colony's best guards crouched among the rocks near the Easter marker. Weapons ready, night vision equipment active, waiting for enemies who would never arrive 3 kilometers away. While the colony's security forces focused on a distraction, the real operation unfolded. The secondary armory was a squat building on the colony's eastern edge, lightly guarded because no one expected an attack from inside the perimeter. Tova had spent weeks mapping the patrol routes and identifying the weakest point of entry. A ventilation shaft on the roof that was far too small for any adult to crawl through, which was why Dren volunteered. Absolutely not, Yuna said when the young Talari proposed the plan. I am the only one who fits. Dren replied with a stubbornness that reminded Yuna painfully of herself. And I am tired of being useless. Tired of being the child everyone has to protect. You are not useless. Then let me prove it. They argued for nearly an hour before Yuna finally relented. Partly because Dren was right about the logistics, and partly because she recognized that some battles could not be won through sheer protective instinct. The infiltration went smoothly. Dren squeezed through the ventilation shaft with centimeters to spare, dropped silently into the dark armory, and spent 10 agonizing minutes finding and disabling the interior lock while Mock and his team waited outside. When the door finally clicked open, Dren stood in the threshold with a grin so wide it seemed to split her young face in half. Told you I could do it, she whispered. They emptied the armory in under 15 minutes, carrying away enough weapons to arm every member of the Forsaken. Twice over by the time Dreth's guards returned from their fruitless vigil at the Easter marker, the raiders had vanished back into the desert like smoke, the discovery of the theft sent Vorath into a fury that surpassed anything his staff had ever witnessed. He broke 3 pieces of furniture and hospitalized 1 guard who was unfortunate enough to deliver the news. How? He screamed at Dreth. How are they getting in and out without being seen? Dreth had no answer, but the answer was spreading through the colony's workforce in excited whispers. The dead are rising. The desert is fighting back. Vorath's time is running out. That night, safely underground, Yuna addressed the assembled Forsaken and the new recruits who had joined them. They had weapons now. Real weapons, and more importantly, they had momentum. This is just the beginning, she told them. We have shown them that we can move freely, that their walls mean nothing, that their fear does not control us anymore. But there is still much to do. What comes next? Savin asked. The old Gorvashi had watched the past weeks with growing wonder as the human female systematically dismantled everything he had believed about the limits of resistance. Now we build something bigger. Yuna replied, we reach out to every worker who is willing to listen. We establish networks inside the colony itself. We make it clear that when the time comes to rise up, they will not be alone. And Vorath, Mok growled, his hand resting on one of the newly acquired rifles. Yuna's expression hardened. Vorath will face justice, she promised. Not revenge, not assassination, but real justice in front of everyone he has ever hurt. When we take that colony, we do it right. We show the galaxy that we are not monsters. We are survivors who want nothing more than to be left in peace. She looked around at the faces watching her. Faces of a dozen different species, united by shared suffering and newfound hope. They threw us out to die, she said quietly. So now it is time to show them what the dead can do. The entrance to the underground sanctuary was hidden. So, while that Yuna walked past it twice before Tova finally stopped and pulled aside a curtain of dried vegetation. That looked exactly like the scrub, growing everywhere else on the rocky hillside. Behind the curtain was a crack in the stone barely wide enough for a person to squeeze. Through one at a time, Tova instructed. And watch your step because the passage drops sharply after the first 10 meters. They descended single file into the Chsti. Darkness with Tova leading and Mok bringing up the rear. The temperature dropped with every step until the murderous heat of the surface became a distant memory, replaced by cool damp air that smelled of mineral, water and growing things. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through blackness, they emerged into a vast cavern lit by bioluminescent fungi that clung to the walls in patches of soft blue and green. Yuna stopped and stared. The cavern stretched before her like an underground cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows high above, its floor covered with structures built from salvaged materials and natural stone. There were shelters and storage areas and what looked like a small farm, where pale vegetables grew in beds of carefully tended soil, and there were people, dozens of them, representatives of at least 8 different species, all watching the newcomers with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to desperate hope. Welcome to the Forsaken, Tova announced. Try not to die down here. We have worked very hard to make this place livable. An elderly Gavashi male emerged from the largest of the shelters and approached the group with slow, deliberate steps. His scales had faded to a dull gray with age, and his body bore the scars of violence, both old and relatively recent, but his eyes were sharp and clear, and they fixed on Yuna with an intensity that made her feel as if she was being measured for something she did not yet understand. I am Elder Savin, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a member of a species known for aggression. I was the first to survive the walk 15 years ago, when I was young and foolish enough to think that anger alone could keep me alive. Unipark, she replied, human freighter pilot. Wrongly convicted. They are all wrongly convicted according to themselves, Savin observed with a thin smile. But that hardly matters down here. What matters is that you survived and you brought others with you. That is more than most manage. He gestured for the group to follow him deeper into the cavern, where other Forsaken were already preparing food and water for the newcomers. Dren pressed close to Yuna's side as they walked, her young eyes wide with wonder at this impossible community thriving beneath the sand. How? The child asked. How is any of this here? Savin overheard the question and answered without breaking stride. The caves were formed millions of years ago by underground rivers, he explained. The water still flows deep beneath us, filtered through rock until it is pure enough to drink. And where there is water, there is life, even in a place designed for death. They reached a central area where rough benches surrounded a natural depression that served as a gathering space. Savin settled onto one of The benches with the careful movements of someone whose body had been broken and rebuilt more than once sit. He invited, eat, drink, rest. And when you have recovered from your ordeal, we will discuss what comes next. What comes next is we strike back, Mock declared, still standing with his massive arms crossed over his chest. We take what weapons we can find, and we make Vorath pay for what he has done. Several of the gathered Forsaken shifted uncomfortably at his words. Savin sighed heavily. You are not the first to say such things, he said quietly. And you will not be the last, but let me tell you what happened to those who tried. He held up one scarred hand and counted off on his fingers. 7 years ago, a Vreni warrior much like yourself led a raid on the colony's perimeter. He began. 12 of our people joined him. They killed 4 guards before the response teams arrived with heavy weapons. None of them came back. He folded one finger down. 5 years ago, a group of Kasari engineers attempted to sabotage the colony's water supply. They were caught before they reached the pumping station. Vorath had them executed publicly to remind the workers what happens to rebels. Another finger folded. 3 years ago, I myself led an assault on the guard barracks during a shift change. We had better weapons then, scavenged from crashed supply ships. We killed 16 guards before Commander Dreth rallied his forces. I lost my left eye and 23 of my people lost their lives. He let his hand drop to his lap. We cannot win by force, he concluded. The Golvashi have ships in orbit. They have communication arrays that can summon reinforcements within hours. They have weapons and armor and training that we cannot match with spears and salvaged scrap. So we just hide down here forever, Mock demanded, his voice thick with contempt. We survive while Vorath keeps sending innocents to die in the sand above our heads. We survive, Savin repeated firmly, because survival is its own form of resistance. Every day we continue to exist is a day we prove that their justice is not absolute, that their power is not total, that some of us refuse to simply disappear. Yuna had been listening in silence, but now she spoke up. You are both right, she said. The arguing stopped as everyone turned to look at her. You are right that direct assault is suicide, she continued, nodding to Savin. And you are right that hiding is not enough, she added, looking at Mock. So we need a third option. And what would that be? Savin asked, his tone skeptical but his eyes curious. Information, Yuna replied. Tell me everything about the colony. Its layout, its schedules, its supply lines, its weaknesses. How often do ships arrive? What do they carry? Who works where and what do they think of their masters? Savin studied her for a long moment. You are planning something, he said. Yes. Something that goes beyond simple revenge. Revenge accomplishes nothing except creating more bodies, Yuna said. I am planning a revolution. The word hung in the air like a held breath. Tova let out a surprised laugh and quickly covered her mouth. Mock's expression shifted from anger to something. That might have been respect. Even Dren seemed to stand a little straighter beside her human. Protect her. A revolution, Savin repeated slowly. Against the Golvashi Dominion, one of the most powerful political entities in the sector. Against this colony, Yuna corrected. Against Vorath and Dreth and the system they have built here, we do not need to defeat the entire Dominion. We just need to make this one place too expensive to maintain. How? The workers in the colony, Yuna said. They are not here because they love the Golvashi. They are here because they have no choice. Indentured servants and contract laborers and people too poor to go anywhere else. If we show them that resistance is possible, if we prove that the walk is not a death sentence, we change the equation. She leaned forward with an intensity that made several of the Forsaken draw back instinctively. Vorath's power depends on fear, she continued. Fear of the desert, fear of the guards, fear of being walked. But fear only works when people believe they have no options. We give them options. We give them hope. And suddenly, Varath's fear becomes our weapon. Savin was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful. I have led these people for 15 years, he said. I have kept them alive by teaching them to be careful, to be patient, to never take risks that could expose us all. And now you ask me to throw that away. I ask you to trust me, Una replied. Not blindly, not foolishly, but enough to let me try something different. And if you fail, then I die and you go back to hiding and nothing changes. Una said simply, but if I succeed, if we succeed, then 15 years of survival finally means something. Savin looked around at his people, at the community he had built from nothing in the depths of the earth. Then he looked back at Una. Tell me your plan, he said. Una allowed herself a small smile. First, I need to know when the next group of prisoners will be walked. 3 days, Tova answered immediately. Vorath follows a strict schedule. He likes his spectacles predictable. Good, Una said. Then we have 3 days to prepare. Prepare for what? Mock asked. Una stood and faced the gathering of Forsaken with eyes that burned with quiet determination. We are going to rescue them, she announced. In broad daylight, in full view of the colony. And then we are going to vanish like ghosts. And when Vorath realizes that the dead are rising from his desert, he will finally understand that his time is running out. The first death came 3 hours after the gates closed behind them. An old Moradi male whose name Una had not learned simply sat down in the sand and refused to move no matter how much the others pleaded with him. His companion, a female of the same species, knelt beside him and held his hand while his breathing slowed and finally stopped. Una stood apart and let them have their moment of grief, even though every minute they delayed brought them closer to the same fate. When the female finally rose with tears making tracks through the dust on her face, Una stepped forward and spoke gently. We need to keep moving. I know, the old female replied. Torvash would not want his death to cause more deaths. He was always practical that way. They left the body where it lay because there was no time and no energy for burial. The vultures would find him soon enough. And perhaps that was its own kind of funeral. By midday the twin suns had climbed to their highest point, and the heat became a physical force that pressed down on the group like a giant hand. 3 more prisoners collapsed, and Una organized the stronger ones into teams of 2 to carry them. Sergeant Mock took the heaviest burden without complaint, slinging unconscious Kazari over his massive shoulders as if the man weighed nothing. You handle a unit well for a cargo pilot, he observed as they walked, his breathing steady despite his load. I read a lot, Una replied. History mostly, accounts of human survival in extreme conditions. Stories of people who crossed impossible distances because giving up was not something they knew how to do. Mock made a sound that might have been approval. The Vreni have similar traditions, he said. My grandmother used to tell stories of the long march across the frozen sea. 3,000 kilometers on foot through ice and wind that could freeze blood in your veins. Then you understand, Una said. I understand that we are still going to die out here, Mock replied flatly. But I respect the choice to die walking instead of lying down. Una shook her head slowly. I do not plan to die at all. The rocks she had spotted from the colony gates turned out to be the remnants of an ancient geological formation. Twisted spires of black stone that cast long shadows across the sand. The group reached them as the suns began their descent toward the horizon, and the temperature dropped just enough to make breathing feel less like inhaling fire. We rest here until full dark, Una announced. Then we travel through the night while the cold keeps us from losing water through sweat. Travel where? One of the Kasari demanded. his voice cracking with desperation. "There is nothing out here but sand and death and more sand." "There is always something," Yuna replied calmly. "Every desert has life hidden in it if you know where to look. Water trapped in rocks, insects and plants that have adapted to survive. And sometimes other things." She pointed to a patch of disturbed sand near the base of one of the rock spires. "Something walked here recently," she continued. "Something on two legs that was not any of us." Mock crouched to examine the tracks, and his scarred face twisted into a frown. "These are fresh," he confirmed. "Made within the last day, possibly less. Gurvashi patrol." One of the other prisoners suggested fearfully. "No." Mock shook his head. "Wrong foot shape, wrong gait. This is someone who knows how to move quietly and does not want to be followed." "Then who?" Dren asked from her spot, pressed against Yuna's side, where she had remained since they started walking. "That is what we need to find out." Yuna said the night fell quickly on Kethrin 4, the twin suns dropping below the horizon as if someone had pulled them down on strings within. An hour the temperature had plummeted from murderous heat to bitter cold, and the prisoners huddled together for warmth in the shelter of the rocks. Yuna showed them how to dig shallow trenches in the sand and pile the gens, displace material around the edges to block the wind. She had learned this from accounts of human nomads who had survived in the deserts of Earth thousands of years before space travel was even a dream. "Your species is strange," the old Moradi female observed as she watched Yuna work. "You have no natural weapons, no armored skin, no venom or claws. Yet you spread across the galaxy as if you belonged everywhere." "We adapt," Yuna replied simply. "It is what we have always done. When the environment tried to kill us, we learned its rules, and then we changed them." "Changed them how?" "We invented shelter when we had no fur, fire when we had no warmth, weapons when we had no claws," Yuna explained. "And when the deserts of our homeworld stood in our way, we learned to run until the prey that fled from us collapsed from exhaustion." She finished digging her trench and settled into it, with a small sigh of relief as the cold wind passed over her instead of through her. "Persistence hunting, some humans called it," she continued. "We could not catch our prey in a sprint, so we simply followed it until it could not run anymore. Hours, sometimes days, never stopping, never giving up. Until finally the thing we chased had nothing left." Mock let out a low rumbling sound that might have been a laugh. "So you are telling me that your species survived by being too stubborn to stop?" "Yes," Yuna confirmed. "That is exactly what I'm telling you." The night deepened, and one by one, the prisoners fell into exhausted sleep. Yuna remained awake, her eyes scanning the darkness, her ears straining for any sound that did not belong. Shortly after midnight, she heard a soft scrape of movement against rock, the whisper of fabric brushing stone, the nearly silent footfall of someone who had spent years learning to move without being detected. "I know you are there," she called into the darkness, her voice calm and clear. "You have been following us since we left the colony." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then a figure emerged from the shadows between two rock spires, moving with fluid grace that spoke of predator ancestry. It was a Kesari female, older than the laborers in Yuna's group, her scales scarred and weathered by years of sun and wind. She wore clothing made from the hide of some desert creature, and she carried a spear tipped with what looked like sharpened bone. "You are observant for someone who should be dead by now," the stranger said. "I get that a lot," Yuna replied. "My name is Yuna Park, and these people are under my protection." The Kesari female studied her for a long moment with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "I am Tova," she finally said, "and I am a scout for the Forsaken." "The Forsaken. Those who walked before you," Tova explained. "Those who were supposed to die in the sand but refused to give Varath the satisfaction." She glanced at the sleeping prisoners, and something that might have been sympathy flickered across her weathered face. "There is water beneath the ground," she continued, "and caves where the suns cannot reach. A community of survivors who have endured for 15 years while the Gorvashi believed their justice was absolute." Yuna felt something shift in her chest. A small flame of hope that she had been carefully tending. Since the moment the gates closed behind her, "Take us." "There," she said. Tova tilted her head and studied the human with open curiosity. "Most who hear of the Forsaken weep with relief," she observed. "You look like you are already planning something." "I am," Yuna confirmed. "What?" Yuna looked toward the distant glow on the horizon. That marked the colony where Vorath sat in comfort while his victims rotted in the sand. "I am planning to go back," she said simply. Tova stared at her for a long moment before a slow smile spread across her scarred face. "I think Elder Savin will want to meet you," she said. "Wake your people, human. We have a long walk ahead, and the vultures are not the only things that hunt these sands at night." Yuna rose and began shaking. The others, awake one by one, Dren blinked up at her with sleepy compound eyes and yawned. "Are we going to die now?" the child asked with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had already made peace with the possibility. "No," Yuna replied. "We are going somewhere safe." "And then what?" Yuna helped the young Talari to her feet and brushed the sand from her thin shoulders. "And then we are going to make sure no one else ever has to make this walk again." The twin suns of Kethrin IV burned like angry eyes in the orange sky as 13 prisoners stood in chains before the colony's central square. Yuna Park kept her spine straight and her face calm even as the heat pressed down on her skull like a weight made of fire. She had been a freighter pilot once, running cargo between the outer colonies and the core worlds, minding her own business and staying out of trouble. Then the Gorvashi inspectors had found weapons in her hold, weapons she had never seen before, weapons that someone had planted there while she slept in a docking station. The trial had lasted less than an hour. Guilty, they had said, and she had known in that moment that guilt or innocence meant nothing on a Gorvashi world. Chief Magistrate Vorath stood on the raised platform above them, his scales gleaming like wet stone in the harsh light. He was tall for his kind, nearly 3 meters of muscle and cold reptilian calculation. And when he smiled, his teeth showed in rows like broken glass. "You stand before the justice of the Gorvashi Dominion," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent square, where hundreds of workers had gathered to watch. Yuna noticed how the workers kept their eyes down and their shoulders hunched, and she understood that this display was not just punishment, but warning. "Look what happens to those who defy us." The spectacle screamed without words. "You have been found guilty of crimes against order and stability," Marith continued, clearly enjoying the performance, "and you have been sentenced to the walk." A sound moved through the crowd. Like wind through dead grass, the walk meant exile into the wasteland with no water and no supplies, and no hope of survival. It meant death by thirst or heat, or the massive carrion birds that circled the desert waiting for creatures to fall. Yuna heard someone sobbing to her left and turned her head slightly to see a young Talari prisoner, shaking so hard that her forearms seemed to blur. The Talari was barely more than a child, her insectoid features soft with youth, her compound eyes wide with terror. Yuna had learned her name was Dren, and her crime had been stealing food from a mining supervisor's kitchen. For that she would die screaming in the sand. "The gates will open," Vorath declared, "and you will walk until the desert claims you, as it has claimed all others who dared to disturb our peace." He paused and let his gaze drift across the line of condemned until it settled on Yuna. Something flickered in his yellow eyes when he saw that she was watching him without fear. "Ah," he said slowly, The human, he descended the steps of the platform with deliberate grace, each footfall heavy and measured, until he stood before her close enough that she could smell the copper scent of his breath. "Your kind is new to this sector," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Soft little creatures from a soft little world, thinking you can carve a place among your betters." Una said nothing. She simply looked at him the way she might look at a broken piece of machinery that needed to be removed and replaced. Vareth's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "You have spirit," he admitted. "But spirit melts quickly under our suns, human, and your soft pink flesh will blister and crack and peel away until there is nothing left but bones for the wind to scatter." He leaned closer still. "Hope the vultures get you first," he hissed, "because that death is faster than the thirst." Una held his gaze for 3 long heartbeats before she spoke in a voice as calm as still water. "I will remember you said that." Something passed across Voreth's face that might have been unease before he masked it with contempt and turned away with a sharp gesture to the guards. "Open the gates," he commanded. "Let the desert have its due." The massive metal gates groaned as they swung outward, and beyond them stretched an ocean of red sand and black rock beneath. A sky that seemed to pulse with heat. Guards shoved the prisoners forward with the butts of their rifles, and one by one they stumbled through the threshold into the wasteland. Una was the last to pass through, and she did not stumble. She walked with her head high and her steps steady, and she did not look back even when the gates crashed shut behind her with a sound like a tomb ceiling. The other prisoners had already begun to scatter in different directions, panic driving them like animals fleeing a fire. Some were crying and some were praying to gods that had clearly stopped listening, and some were simply standing frozen as if their minds had already surrendered to the inevitable. Una counted them quickly in her head. 12 others besides herself, of Vreni male built like a mountain, with the bearing of a soldier. A handful of thin Kesari laborers. 2 elderly members of a species she did not recognize, the young Talari named Dren, and several others in various states of physical breakdown. "Listen to me," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. A few heads turned toward her, but most continued their panicked scattering. The Vreni soldiers stopped and looked at her with something that might have been curiosity or contempt. I said, "Listen." Una repeated, louder this time, "Because if you run off alone, you will die within hours, and everything Voreth said about you will become true." That got their attention. One of the Kesari males let out a bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. "And what does a human know about surviving this?" he demanded, gesturing at the endless hell that surrounded them. "I know that scattered prey dies faster than a group that stays together," Una replied calmly. "And I know that panic uses more water than walking. And right now the only water we have is what is already inside our bodies." She pointed toward the horizon, where a line of jagged rocks broke the monotony of the sand. "There will be shade there," she continued. "And shade means surviving until nightfall. And nightfall means the temperature drops enough that we can actually travel without cooking from the inside out." The Vreni soldier studied her for a long moment before he spoke in a voice like grinding stones. "Sergeant Mock," he said, 3rd Assault Division of the Vreni Confederation, convicted for refusing to execute civilians during the Caress suppression. He moved to stand beside her. "I have seen enough death to know when someone understands survival," he added. "And you speak like someone who has studied it." "Una Park," she replied, "freighter pilot wrongly convicted. And yes, I have studied it because my species walked across deserts that would kill most creatures in the galaxy, and we did it before we even discovered fire." She turned and began walking toward the distant rocks at a pace that was steady but not rushed. "Stay close," she said over her shoulder. "Help the ones who cannot keep up, and save your breath for moving instead of arguing. One by one, the others fell into step behind her. Mach took position at the rear, herding the stragglers forward with gruff commands. The two elderly aliens supported each other with quiet dignity. The Kasari followed in a tight cluster, their fear slowly transforming into something that might eventually become hope. And Dren, the young Talari child condemned to die for stealing bread, crept up beside Yuna and reached out with one trembling hand to touch her arm. "Why? Are you helping us?" she asked in a voice so small it nearly disappeared. Into the wind, Yuna did not slow her pace, but she looked down at the child with eyes that held no pity, only steady determination. "Because that is what my people do," she answered. "We survive, and we bring others with us." Behind them, the colony gates had become a dark line on the horizon ahead. The rocks waited with their promise of shade and temporary safety, and somewhere in the distance, hidden among the crags and shadows, something watched the group of condemned prisoners, walking with unexpected purpose. Across the burning sand, it was not a vulture. It moved on two legs, and it carried tools, and it had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally fight back.